Joining again. For those of you who joined last week, apologies for the delay in the connection. We decided to reschedule. So we're here today to talk about intergenerational trauma. And our guest speaker today is Dr. Lashley. I'm really excited to have her join us. She's an expert in the area. I'm very passionate about this topic. And we've had a couple of conversations on the subject matter, so I'm now excited to finally be live and share this with the audience. So Dr. Lashley, why don't we start by you giving us a bit of a background on your career, your areas of research, and what your career has looked like over the last 20 years or so.
Oh, well, I'm a PhD out of McGill University. I've worked in this area with First Nations, with Caribbeans. I've been a consultant to the Brazil Medical Service, the mental health service in Brazil. Worked out of there for 2 years. I've presented all over the world. I've written. I teach in the medical department of McGill University. I'm part of the faculty of medicine at McGill in the Department of Psychiatry. And I teach cultural psychology to physicians and to other professionals.
Wonderful. So I see we have people joining in. For those that are watching, please feel free to add to the comments any questions you have. We will get to those towards the end. But Dr. Lashley, can you tell us, what intergenerational trauma means, an overview of what it means for those that aren't aware of that term?
It's a trauma that, as the name implies, trauma that's passed on from one generation to another. So something happens, something causes extreme stress to people in one generation, and then that is transmitted. And the thing is that it gets transmitted in several ways, but one of the major ways, of course, is that by the very things you try to put in place to help the offspring not to deal with it, it then has the opposite effect sometimes of making them so anxious that they carry the trauma. The other way, of course, is through the epigenetics, which I'm not going to get into a lot here, but there is a body of knowledge that says that when you've experienced a trauma, it attaches to your DNA. I mean, it doesn't change your eyes or your nose or anything. It's not that kind. But what is called epi, it attaches itself to it. And so that gets passed down from one generation to another. So you've sustained trauma and you pass it on. Genetically, of course, it's not a deliberate act, but certainly the emotional component of it. And as I said, very often you're trying to protect someone, and through the very methods that you use to try to protect them, you actually often exacerbate the problem. Not that the problem isn't, it's just that.
Okay. And sorry to cut you off there. Just historically, can you tell us a bit about what trauma would have looked like, specifically within the Black community?
Okay, trauma within the Black community, really, a lot of it has to do with racism. If you look back at the genesis of it, a lot of people will say, well, it started with the Middle Passage when people were physically uprooted from their homes in Africa and brought across. They lost their sense of self. They lost their identity. They even lost their hairstyles, which were markers which you could use when you were there on the African continent. You could tell what tribe someone came from, what status they had, what their marriageability status was, all that was taken away. The hair products that people used were taken away. Their languages were taken away. Their religion was taken away. I mean, but their sense of self was erased and replaced by something which was very colonial in its nature. It was telling you you're not as good as, your skin is not as good as, you were made 2/3 of a person, you could be sold like cattle. I mean, it was a very dehumanizing effect, and it has continued on. Some people will say, well, we had the civil rights movement, but don't forget that the civil rights movement left people in a lot of poverty. I mean, the poverty throughout the United States is horrible. And unfortunately, Canadians tend to look at Black Canadians through the eyes of Black Americans. We have to stop doing that. We all get tarred with the same brush, in a way.
Okay. So when we look at the trauma now historically and how it appears nowadays amongst family members, what kind of behavior are we looking at? Like, how is it being translated?
Well, you can see violence, you can see anxiety, you can see people going into withdrawal. People are afraid to express themselves. They've learned how to, through the years, how to keep their mouth shut about certain things, so they don't know how to express themselves and say, this is what I'm feeling, because it's been embedded in them that you don't talk about things. People are afraid of authority figures, for example. The police is a classic example. You look at how very often the police treat people. People talk about racial profile, and one of the things I didn't tell you is that I do a lot of work with the police. People talk about racial profiling, and it gets carried on. So it's manifested both emotionally and physically.
Okay.
You can see addictions, for example.
Right. And then, you know, we had a conversation earlier today about this idea of, you know, the strong Black woman or the strong Black man. And there's a lot of challenge that comes out of that. Can you talk us through that? Because, you know, my thought process is, well, it's a good thing to be raised a strong person, right? To be raised a bit more resilient, but there's obviously a negative to that as well.
Yes, as we were saying earlier, yes, we were talking earlier, and as I said to you, the downside of that is that a lot of people believe I can do anything to these people because they can withstand it. I mean, that is the narrative, of course, that came out of the times of slavery, that, you know, you can't put certain people in the field, but these Black people you can put in the field because they don't feel pain the same way. And one of the things that we saw in the medical system was that there was a time when Black people weren't given the pain medication that they needed, because they were saying, oh, well, they can withstand the pain. They don't need it as much. Their skin is thicker. The other thing about it is that you say, well, these people are resilient. They can stand things. But it also means that you don't treat them in the same way. It becomes another form of racism, because if they can withstand everything that we throw at them, we don't have to worry about what we throw at them, because they can take it. You know, and you look at it even in silly things like they can take a joke. How dare you be upset that I insult you with a joke? Come on, and you've heard the expression, "You've got thick skin." Or why don't you develop? Well, it's that kind of thing, that you've got this, partly you've got a thick skin, you don't feel pain as much, so you can do anything you want to these people, and it's going to be all right, and they'll be able to laugh off the so-called joke, and you don't have to give them the same services, you know, that kind of thing. So it has a downside.
And then I guess coming from the standpoint of being raised in a family where your parents have experienced trauma in the past, whether it's racism or witnessing violence or, you know, a variety of different things, how does that show up in parenting? And then, you know, what are the layers to that?
Well, the thing is, you if you've been taught, if you're through the generations, you've been taught, don't talk about the things you're feeling. Don't let anybody in. Keep everything to yourself. Everything stays inside the home. I mean, it's not, you don't only see that in Black families. You see that in a lot of families where trauma has been an issue. You see it among First Nations. You see it around in European Jews. Any come, any people that have gone through this, you see it. But in the Black family, they've had to keep the secrets for so long. Even if something happened within the family, you couldn't let the police know, because if they took away, let's say a man was beating his wife, if they took him away, well, then who was going to support that family? And even if, and very often there were no places to send them, because they weren't going to put the Black women in with the white women, and all the shelters were mostly for white women, so you kept your mouth shut.
Right.
I had a patient who said to me once, I was trying to get her to induce her to go into a shelter. She was being abused, and she said, it's okay for you. She said, when I come home at night and I tell my husband that somebody called me the N-word, he understands it. If you put me in a shelter and I tell somebody, and somebody in the shelter calls me an N-word, who's going to understand me? Who's going to stand up for me? So she preferred to stay where she was, even though she was being abused. Took a lot of energy to help her to get out of there, to find an appropriate place, because, as I said to you earlier, most people don't have the skills, the training, or the background to understand how to enter into the world of Black people who are going through this trauma and help them.
Yeah. Yeah. Before we go there, I mean, just to kind of touch a bit more on how it's manifesting, you know, when there is this notion of like, I'm a strong Black woman, I can't express myself because I might get, you know, labeled as weak, or, you know, anxiety, like that's only what white people face, you know, that's not me. So how, you know, what is it like out there right now in the healthcare system? Are there a lot of Black people going and entering the healthcare system for care? How are they dealing with it?
Well, very often within the Black community, the person who becomes the therapist is the minister. You know, that traditionally the church has played a role within the Black community of social services, ministerial services. Everything is wrapped up in that. The church is very important very often within the Black community, because Black people as a whole, and I know I don't want to overgeneralize this, but as a whole, Black people don't trust the medical system, and they certainly don't trust the mental health system. And if you look at it historically, very often they've been used as guinea pigs. They've been, you know, if you look at the Tuskegee experiment, where it's false to say they gave them syphilis. They didn't give them syphilis. They just didn't treat the syphilis, because they wanted to see how this whole disease progressed. And this thing went on up until the 50s. I mean, so they don't trust the system. But most importantly, they don't believe that there's going to be anybody there who's going to understand what it feels like to be the victim of racism, what it feels like to have to deal with the stereotypes. And so if they're fighting to get treatment and fighting the person who's giving them the treatment at the same time, who's telling them, no, that's not racism, you don't know what you're talking about, it's this, well, then why bother going? Because it becomes another form of oppression.
And do you have any like statistics or anything on how many, you know, percentage-wise, how many people are actually seeking help and how many people are struggling in the Black community, or
No.
no? Okay.
No, I don't have those numbers, because usually only in research do you find those numbers. When you take somebody into the hospital, of course you write their race, but you don't, as they see it, because it used to be people just wrote this person's Black and this person's white. Well, now they realize they can't do that. You have to look at how the person self-identifies. You have to ask them that. Certainly in the educational system in Quebec, we don't keep those data, so I don't have the numbers for you. I'm sure they can be found if I look at research, but I've never looked on seeking for it.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to talk about, I mean, one of the traumas that is experienced is obviously racism, and that's carried out through many, many generations. Can we talk a little bit about that, and, you know, what that looks like today, and the lack of belief from some white people that racism doesn't exist anymore, and what the repercussions of that are.
You mean the repercussions of saying that racism no longer exists, that we live in a post-racial world?
Yeah, just that belief system.
That's, well, apart from the fact that it's silly,
Mm-hmm.
Racism exists everywhere, so it's a silly statement to begin with. That having been said, if you are my friend, or if you, well, let's stick to friend. Let's not go into therapy for a second. Let's say you're my friend, and you call yourself really my friend, and I come to you and I say, look, this has happened to me, and this is the pain it's causing me, and you tell me, oh no, it doesn't matter, that didn't happen. Or one of the worst things you can say to people is forget about it. It doesn't mean anything. Why are you letting this thing bother you? Or just sweep it off your shoulder. You just told me that my feelings don't mean anything and that I should just swallow my feelings. If I have to swallow my feelings, I have to constantly swallow my anxiety. What happens is that has mental health repercussions because I have nowhere to go. I also don't trust you anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm now, you called yourself my friend, but now I have to be picking and choosing. I have to be very careful with the things with which I trust you, because I can't afford to give you my inner self anymore to have it smashed. Now, let's multiply that and say that you're my therapist. And I come to you with that and you give me that kind of feedback. Maybe it makes you feel uncomfortable to have to deal with racism. I don't know, but it doesn't help me. Mm-hmm. As the therapist. I mean, it doesn't help me as the client. The other thing is, let's say that you do believe me, but you've got some impetus to protect me. What very often happens is that, you know, the social justice warriors, for example, they mean well. They want to do the right thing, but they often end up taking over the narrative, so that it becomes another form of oppression. So rather than walking with the person and assisting the person, they end up taking it over and saying, this is what you should do, or this is what I'm going to do for you, which continues the infantilization of that person so that they don't get to stand on their own 2 feet. So if you're going to assist, but don't become another oppressor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I know that you do a lot of work in training, and I don't know if training's the right word, but counseling, educating people on the cultural side of therapy. Can you talk a bit more about that and the lack of that currently exists?
The training is, there's a lack of training. A lot of people don't know how to work with this community. And I often say that even Black people who are working in this community, who haven't undergone the training, are working from a Eurocentric perspective, because that's what we've all been taught. We've been taught Freud, and we've been taught Jung, and Adler and Sullivan and all these people, but they were all white people saying things through a right frame. Mm-hmm. And the concept of Black people and racism and those things, they really didn't understand it. I'm not calling these people evil, not at all. I mean, some of them were racist, but that's a whole different ballgame. But those are the paradigms that we were all taught. So unless you have been retrained, unless you've been made to understand what it's like to live within a racist society, to live within a society that sees you as the other, and the pain that causes, and the trauma that causes, and the trauma that gets passed on from generation to generation, becomes very difficult for you to help people. So we know that we now have a lot of training programs. The American Psychiatric Association, who's the people who put out the DSM books, we call them the Bibles, the DSMs. I started in I think it was DSM 3R, where they started thinking about, that R means revised, when they started thinking about racism and things like that. It became more prevalent in DSM-4, and now it's incorporated into DSM-5, although there's still some issues with it. That training has to take place. We have to go from a completely Eurocentric way of looking at the world to understanding other modalities, other ways of seeing the world. And if I may give you an example, a lot of Caribbean people who went to England thought they were going to the motherland because that's the way it was sold. You are part of England. They got there and realized that they were not part of England. We also realized that more Black people in England were being diagnosed with schizophrenia than white people. Whereas in the Caribbean, they would not have been, because the white doctors there really didn't understand what racism was about. And so when people rebelled against racism, or when they saw them falling apart and they were talking about this thing, they said, oh, they've got schizophrenia. They didn't have schizophrenia. They were dealing with racism.
Wow. That's interesting. I had a question that's kind of escaped me. I listened to a talk, I guess, a couple months ago where they were talking about PTSD in the Black community, and children that are seeing violence. This was in the US, so children that were seeing violence at a young age, and then getting caught up in theft or different minor kind of things, and there was no intervention early on, and then 20 years later they're now going to jail for murder, for example. Do you have any thoughts on that, like in terms of earlier intervention to help people that are going through trauma, that have gone through trauma? Is it really just a matter of more education out there, more things like this to kind of raise awareness on, that trauma can manifest in mental illness, in violence, in anger, and different things like that?
I think it's important for people to know, but you're not going to get rid of it just by saying stop doing it. The first thing we have to do is to identify the source. And once we identify the source, then we start to look at an analysis of what we found. What's going on? How is this being manifested? Once we've got the source, we work from there. How is this being manifested? What strategies do we have to put in place in order to change it? And how long is it going to take? Well, a lot of that is going to be idiosyncratic, but certainly first the source, then the analysis, then the strategies. Concomitantly, of course, we have to work with the larger community and say, these are some of the issues. Social workers need to know to look at trauma as an issue, racial trauma as an issue. Physicians need to know it, psychologists, psychiatrists, the general public. The general public has to be aware that some of the things that they say and do may, in fact, that they think are jokes, may, in fact, be harming that child. Going up to a child and putting your hand in their hair without permission and saying, oh, you cute little monkey. Well, do you know what that means to people within the Black community? Do you know what hair signifies to them within the Black community? Do you understand what you're doing to this child when you say to this child, oh, your hair is like a bear's, you've got bear hair. Your hair is not nice. Why isn't it flowing? Well, do you understand? They've got to be made to understand that words have consequences. I'm not saying that people can't make jokes, but understand what a joke is and what a joke is not. So you have to do both things concomitantly. Look at the source, analyze the source, create the strategies, and also the educational component.
What would you say to people out there that are currently suffering in silence, that are afraid to come forward to friends or family because of the stigma, afraid to enter the healthcare system because they might have experienced, a lack of understanding in the past? How can we start empowering these individuals to come forward and seek help and start looking at, why certain behaviors are happening or why they're experiencing severe anxiety or depression, what would you say to those individuals?
I would tell them to find somebody who is skilled in understanding what they're going through. What we're doing here in Montreal, and we had to stop it because of the crisis that's occurring right now with COVID-19, is that we were creating a repertoire of people who are trained in working in this area, who understand the consequences of racism, who understand the consequences of stereotype. A lot of whom, are black, because you don't have to be black to do it, but you have to have a black conscience to understand it, to help people and safe places where they can go. We also have to work with ministers because, as I said to you, a lot of people go to see their ministers. We have to work with families to explain to them, to get them to understand that holding on to this pain is non-productive and, in fact, can be very destructive to their offsprings and future generations. So it's almost like a public health approach that you have to take, where you have to get all the people who are involved in the lives of these folk and get them all to understand so that they all have a similar working definition of what's happening, so that people feel comfortable stepping into that space. And we call it cultural safety, a culturally safe space. The clinician and the teacher and the social worker, whoever, they have to develop cultural humility, which means they have to accept they don't know and they're willing to learn. Sometimes your best way of learning is to shut up and listen.
Right.
Rather than going in there and thinking, well, I've got the PhD or I've got the MD, so I know all there is to know. No, you don't. So you have to develop cultural humility and learn and explore and ask for explanation and read your histories, read your novels, understand that a lot of the things that are not written, sometimes people even write novels to get rid of some of the pain, to expiate. And those are things so it's a whole of profession approach. It's very much like a public health approach.
When, looking at recovery or therapy for something like depression or anxiety, there are tools like, or therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. Would treating somebody who's experiencing depression that's Black as opposed to that's white, doing that standard therapy, I guess, are you suggesting that there's more to just that? There's like the psychotherapy side of it as well?
Yes, I think, one of the things that you have to do is to do a cultural intake interview. And that's certainly in the DSM-5. You can learn how, culturally. And one of the things you want to understand is, what does this illness mean to the person? Not what it means to you necessarily. What does it mean to the person? How do they define the illness? How is it manifested to them? How would it normally be treated in their community? How would it normally be treated in their family? You have to do a really full intake. We call it the cultural interview. You have to do that. You have to understand. And don't forget that we might label something in our Eurocentric way of looking at things. We might label it as one thing, which means absolutely nothing to that person, or may even be frightening to them.
Right.
Because the whole concept of mental illness for some people is, that does not happen in my family. I can't talk about that. That is the terrible thing to happen, because they know what happened to people before. They don't want to go there. So sometimes you don't even use that word. So how is this labeled for you? What do you think it is? What is it called within your community, and how is it treated? So we have to meet them. We have to meet them, as people say, meet them where they're at. That's what you have to do.
Yeah.
And then from there, Yeah,
no, I love that.
you develop the treatment with them. Sorry?
No, I just said I love that explanation.
I'm sorry?
I just said I loved that explanation.
Okay. We're still here. We're hanging in.
Good,
Okay.
good, good, good. Yeah, no, I can hear you well. Um, are are you optimistic about where we're at now and where you see things going?
Yes, I am. I have a lot of faith, and I especially have faith in young people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have faith in young people because so many of them have grown up in a multicultural era and have multicultural friends. It used to be that white people stuck with white people, black people stuck with black people, Ukrainians stuck with Ukraine, whatsoever. But now I look around me and I look at my classes and I look at the medical students coming through, and they all coming from different backgrounds, and they're all friends, and they're supporting each other and eating each other's meals and learning about each other, which tells me that they're open to learning, they're open to understanding. And that gives me hope, which means that
Mm-hmm.
they are more likely. I'm always amazed at all the Caucasians who say to me, I have a girlfriend or a boyfriend or what happened from a different ethnicity. I have a friend from Jamaica, or I have a friend from Barbados, and they're learning. So I have hope. I have a lot of hope that this is going to change.
Yeah. Okay. I have a couple more questions, but I just wanted to open it up to the audience. If you do have any questions, feel free to write them in the comment section, and we'll get to it in a minute. We talked about it a lot today, and I know that you work in Montreal. Are there resources available, out there that we can post alongside? We're going to be uploading this to our website, madeofmillions.com. Are there different articles or journals that we can reference
Yes,
to people?
yeah, we have the multicultural mental health,
Mm-hmm.
and I will send a link to you,
Okay, wonderful.
because you can go there and you can find things on different ethnicities and in different areas. Yeah, I will send that to you.
Okay, great.
Here in Montreal also, we have the Cultural Consultation Service, which is a service when someone comes in and they've got a particular cultural issue, they send them in to us. Dr. Jarvis is the head of that service, gets the right person to do the assessment. We'll do the assessment. We'll do them for other doctors or what have you. We tell them what the issue are. We meet with the people. We do the assessment. We don't treat at the Cultural Consultation Service,
Mm-hmm.
but we send the report back to the physician or the social worker or whoever requested it.
Okay, great. I wanted to mention one thing. I know that both of
Could
our
you speak a little bit louder? I'm losing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, but you're a bit faint. I don't know what happened. You just went away and I've got my...
Okay, can you hear me now?
Oh my.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. There you are.
Okay, good. Both of our families are from Barbados, so that's an
Yes.
interesting connection that we have. I have my Barbados necklace on right here. Can we end off a little bit on your own personal experience? I know you mentioned the accent thing and coming to Canada,
Yes.
and I thought that was an interesting story and kind of put things into perspective. Would you be willing to share that part?
You mean my personal part about my dad?
Well, mainly whatever you're comfortable with, but more so the accent and your mother kind of,
Oh, yes. Yeah. Very often, my mom did, and again, if you look back at the trauma, but it was she didn't want us to speak with a thick Barbadian accent because she felt that, she wanted our accent to be so-called cultured accent because she didn't want us to be in a position where we couldn't enter into all phases of society. And so she was very circumspect about the way we spoke, the cadence that we employed. And if you want to see it at play, you should listen to the Prime Minister of Barbados now, the Honorable Mia Motley. She speaks that way. It's a very cultured accent. She's very erudite. She enunciates very carefully. This is what I got, because it was important that the message not be sent that we were not worthy of entering into that august society.
Right. Okay. Do you have anything else you wanted to share with the audience? We're gonna, like I said, this will be posted on our website, and we'll share some of the resources that you're gonna share to us. But any final words that you'd like to share?
I would just say that, we all have to learn to get along. And that words hurt, that things that you think are funny may be causing people a lot of pain. And so we should be very careful about that. But reach out. If you ask people, they will usually tell you. But if you ask them, what is racism like? What is it like to live with it? Listen to what they tell you rather than telling them, well, you're wrong. It can't possibly be like that. Maybe it's difficult for you to understand because you don't live it. But don't tell them that their reality, that what they're living isn't happening. Because they're just going to shut up and not talk to you anymore.
Yeah. Fair point. Well, thank you so much for joining. And, maybe we'll have you on again in the near future if you're up to it. And we'll go into
lovely
dive a bit deeper into one of the parts of the conversation that we had. I know we talked about a lot today, but it's really, it's amazing work that you're doing, and us at Made of Millions, we're huge supporters in, looking at all aspects of all different cultures. And so we'd love to, chat with you again, and really excited to have had you join us. And for the audience, this will be uploaded onto our website, and we'll also share Dr. Lashley's contact information or social media, whatever you're comfortable, whatever you're okay with, and any resources you think would be helpful for our audience and our community.
Thank you. Do we have any questions that need to be answered yet?
I don't think so. I just see a lot of waves, and great live stream. Thanks for the info, and this is so interesting, very interesting. A lot of hearts. But I don't see any questions, so I guess we've touched on everything.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, and yeah, we will we'll chat soon.
Yeah, and I'll upload those links for you.
Yes, that would be fantastic. Okay.
Okay, take good care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.